With anamorphic lenses becoming more affordable and therefore more popular, cameras need to keep up. The Lumix S1II, I think, is the best mirrorless camera for shooting anamorphic, but it's not perfect. Let's talk about it. Now, for a while, mirrorless cameras like this have only been able to shoot in 16:9. A lot of mirrorless cameras still do only shoot in 16:9, which is the standard for, TVs and computer screens, so a lot of horizontal content. But for anamorphic, that's not ideal because of how they squeeze more information onto the sensor to create a wider aspect ratio. If you take a 16:9 image, squeeze it by 1.5 times, or even 2 times, if you're talking about 2 times anamorphics, that's going to be a ridiculously wide aspect ratio, and for a lot of things, it's just too much. Most cameras like this these days have a 3:2 sensor. The cameras that can only shoot in 16:9 just don't use the top and bottom portions of those sensors for video. For photo, you can usually shoot in 3:2. A lot of Sony and Nikon and Canon cameras, that's what you have to deal with. But Lumix is one company that's been doing open gate for a while and utilizing that full 3:2 sensor. And the benefit of utilizing the top and bottom portion of that sensor, basically having a taller image, is when you do stretch a 1.5 times or even 2 times image out with an anamorphic lens, it's not going to be ridiculously wide, just appropriately or tastefully wide. Now, all the examples that I'm going to use in this video are with the Blazar Remus 1.5 times anamorphic. If you're going to use 2 times, then obviously the calculations would be for that. And 1.3 or 1.33 has been pretty common recently as well. Those are more aimed towards utilizing 16:9 sensors rather than 3:2, but 3:2 at a 1.33 times crop is actually a 2:1, which is exactly what I'm exporting this final video in right now. This right here is 6K open gate, so we're shooting in full 3:2. So this original 3:2 image that looks like this, desqueezed, ends up being a 2.25 to 1 aspect ratio, and then for the 2 to 1 final export, I'll cut off the very edges, that last 0.25 at the edge. So this can be really good for a final 2 to 1 export, as well as even a 241 or 239 or 235 to 1 aspect ratio, because all you need to do is crop off the top and bottom just a little bit. And now we're shooting in 4:3, which is on this camera 4800 by 3600, and 4:3 can be really good for 1.5 times anamorphics, because 4:3 with a 1.5 times desqueeze will actually get you a 2 to 1 at final aspect ratio. So this is not cropped at all for this video. And because it is that 2 to 1, you could reasonably easily crop off the sides a little bit to get a 16:9 final deliverable, or just like 3:2, crop off the top and bottom a little bit to get that 235 or 239 or 2.4 to 1 final aspect ratio. Although if you were going for a final 239 or something like that, you'd probably want to be more along the lines of a 3:2 rather than a 4:3, because you're going to be cutting off a lot of the top and bottom if you're going to shoot in 4:3. Now this right here is that same 4:3 aspect ratio, again desqueezed to a 2:1, but this is in APS-C mode. So this is the 3.3K mode, which would be probably about 4K if you had the full width, but because it's cropping it on the sides to get that 4:3, it's using basically a Super 35 size portion of this sensor to get that 3.3K APS-C. As you can see, the field of view is a lot smaller because it's cropped in on the sensor while keeping that same 4:3 aspect ratio. This could be useful if you wanted to get a little bit extra reach out of maybe a single prime lens. Like this 33mm right now is probably looking closer to something like a 50mm. And then when we get into more of these sort of normal modes for spherical lenses, when you're shooting on anamorphic, you're going to get even wider. So this is a 16:9 5.9K mode, which is basically the full width of the sensor, but not the full height. And this is more close to what you'd get out of a Sony or a Canon or a Nikon mirrorless camera, because they only shoot in 16:9 or 17:9. Some of them have 17:9 modes as well. And desqueeze, this final aspect ratio is more like a 2.66 to 1, which is not unheard of when it comes to films like in theaters. Like an example is The Creator, which was famously shot on the FX3. That was a final 2.66 to 1 aspect ratio, but it's still pretty rare in general because it is very wide and very short. But if you want to make it even wider, you can shoot in a native 2.4 to 1, and again, desqueezed, it's going to be ridiculously wide. So if you do want something that's just way out there, you could shoot 241 and then desqueeze it again by 1.5, but this is more like something you'd shoot on spherical lenses, and just that's the final crop already. You wouldn't crop it in post, it's just already like that. But when you add on the anamorphic element, it's probably too wide for basically anything. This ends up being a 3.6 to 1 aspect ratio, which is just ridiculous. The only screens that I know of that are basically this aspect ratio, they're actually not quite this wide, but that is like those 49-inch dual QHD monitors that are basically two 27-inch monitors side by side, but as one screen. They're usually something like 5K wide and like 1440p high or something like that. And those are 32:9 monitors, which they're pretty rare. Not that many people have those. And I guess if you wanted to watch something full screen on that, you could shoot in 2.4:1 in 1.5 times anamorphic and then just, fill up the entire screen. But that is a lot of width and you're going to lose a lot of height when you do that. And back to 3x2 for a second, because this is actually in the 5.1K mode, which basically gives you the ability to shoot at higher frame rates in OpenGate. In the full 6K resolution for 3x2 OpenGate, you can't shoot above 30 FPS. So if you did want to shoot, like right now I'm shooting in 24, if I wanted to shoot at 48, or I think you can shoot 60 in this mode. If you did want to shoot at those higher frame rates, you can still shoot in OpenGate just by downsampling the sensor a little bit and only doing a 5.1K rather than the full 6K. But it still uses the full size of the sensor. It just downsamples the resolution slightly to be able to get those higher frame rates. Now, right now I'm only shooting in 24, but you can shoot in 48 or 50 or 60. Now, right now I do also have dynamic range boost on, so you can't shoot in those higher frame rates with dynamic range boost on, but that's not a big deal. Just don't use dynamic range boost. You don't need dynamic range boost. It's only about an extra little bit less than a stop dynamic range, and it slows down the readout a lot. But for a shot like this, doesn't matter. But if you're going to shoot something in slow motion, you probably have a bit of movement, so you want to not be using the dynamic range boost mode anyway. Now, when it comes to monitoring anamorphic on this camera, this is one of the really good things about these Lumix cameras. They have a built-in desqueeze. There's issues with it, but at least it's there. So if I turn on desqueeze, you can see I have an already desqueezed image. It's not in that native 3x2, it's already stretched out so I can monitor what it'll actually look like. And the options for desqueeze on here are 1.3, 1.33, 1.5, 1.8, and 2 times. Now there are some 1.6 times anamorphics, so you obviously wouldn't be able to get the exact desqueeze in your monitoring with those lenses, but that will cover most anamorphic lenses in all of those options. And I think one of the biggest downsides with how you select your desqueeze like this is there's no custom option. It's good to have all those presets because those are really common lenses. But say if I wanted to shoot vertiscope, which is where you turn your camera vertical but keep the lens horizontal, this is only possible with PL lenses because you can rotate them 90 degrees. If I do that, I need a 0.66 times squeeze, not a 1.5. But there's no way to have a custom desqueeze in the camera itself. So you would have to do that on an external monitor. I don't think it would be too hard of a feature to just include a custom option that you can then just like set to whatever number you want. The other benefit to having a custom option is if you've done some testing and you think, oh, this isn't actually 1.5, it's more like 1.45 or something like that. And I'm pretty sure that is the case with the Blazar Mantis. A few people have done some testing and said that it's not actually 1.33, it's like 1.39 or something like that. That would just be super helpful in that case as well. Now, still with monitoring on the LCD itself, that's when you kind of have the issue of you're looking at a really small screen and the image that you're looking at has been made even smaller because it's kept the width, but it's made the height smaller. So you're actually looking at a very small image, and the LCD screen on this camera is actually pretty decent, but it's not going to be the best for seeing critical focus, especially with lenses that aren't super sharp, like a lot of anamorphics aren't very sharp. And it obviously can't get as bright as some external monitors that you would normally be monitoring cameras like this with. So it's okay for things like framing and rough focus, but if you want to get precise focus, you're going to need to monitor externally, which has several issues. When you're monitoring externally on the S1II, there is a bit of a HDMI delay, which is not ideal, and that goes for everything, not just shooting anamorphic. And you can decrease that delay by turning off the sound if you don't need sound going through HDMI. That'll improve the delay, but it's still not perfect. But that's not even that big of a deal when it comes to anamorphic. What is a big deal is the desqueeze that you turn on in the camera does not go through HDMI. So that means that I have to turn on a desqueeze on my monitor here. So if I turn off the desqueeze on the monitor, and then in my camera settings, if I set the info display for HDMI to on, because sometimes you want to be able to see all the info on the monitor itself, that doesn't take the desqueeze with it for some reason. What would be nice is if the desqueeze went through HDMI no matter whether you had info display on or off. Because now the annoying part, this is not desqueezed. So if I turn on desqueeze, I'd set that to 1.5, and now it's desqueezed everything, including the info. Now the issue with doing the desqueeze on the monitor is it won't actually use the full width of the monitor because the original image from the camera is coming through at a 3:2 aspect ratio. It's not going to use the full width of the monitor here, no matter what the aspect ratio of the monitor is. And then if I desqueeze that, it's going to keep that width, but then just shorten the height of it. So now I am only using like that center portion, and then there's just black bars on the sides of my monitor, which is not very helpful. And a weird thing that I find with this is the text or the info display is actually going past where the image is. So I don't see why it couldn't just use the full width. And this isn't a problem with this monitor because the same thing happens on my Porky's monitor when I was using the Blackmagic Pixis, and now actually on the Cinema Camera 6K. If I turn on desqueeze on this camera, it'll go through HDMI, SDI, whatever it needs to go through, and every single image in that chain will be desqueezed what you set it in camera. And I think that's the best way to do anamorphic desqueeze, because you're not going to have some monitors that you don't want desqueeze on. So you may as well turn desqueeze on as early as you can in that chain and just desqueeze everything. Now Lumix, the one thing you need to do to make the S1II even better at shooting anamorphic is you need to allow that desqueeze to go through to your external monitor or your transmitter, whatever you're using. Let desqueeze go through HDMI so I don't have to basically turn my 7-inch monitor into a 5-inch monitor for no reason. And now finally, one thing that I think Lumix is the only company that does this, and that is Anamorphic IBIS. So when it comes to stabilization, not many other cameras have anamorphic stabilization. This is with stabilization off, doing a little vlog test, I guess. So like have a look at the edges and how everything moves when the camera does. This is how it would work with like any other camera, literally, apart from Lumix. Not that anyone really vlogs on anamorphic. And this is with stabilization turned on, set to 1.5 with the anamorphic stabilization. Again, look at the edges, look at, you know, when things move, how much the frame itself moves. I actually haven't really used the anamorphic stabilization all that much, so I'll be looking at it the first time when I'm actually editing this video. And this is with the stabilization, so it's got additional electronic stabilization turned on, so we'll see if it's a little bit smoother. Every time I jump off that little ledge there, I reckon there'll be a big difference between all of these. And then lastly, we'll turn it on to the high stabilization. So again, that's going to crop in a lot more. And again, like we're on the 33mm, and I'm really holding my arm out to even just get this framing. So it's not ideal when it comes to this lens in particular, but you know, it should be doing a decent amount. We'll just have to watch the edges to see if there's much wobbling around those edges, because that can be pretty common with a lot of electronic stabilization. But because Lumix seems to be the only company doing anamorphic stabilization, we'll see how it really just works compared to spherical stabilization. And finally, this is with the Boost IS, which is not meant for like actually moving. It's meant for like handheld stuff. So I am just going to stand still for this and hold the camera as still as I can. And I will also just say this is the weirdest vlogging setup ever. Like I've got a PGY Tech Mantis pod, which, you know, isn't that weird, but I've then got the S1II with a laser Remus anamorphic lens and a matte box on here, because the issue with this lens being anamorphic and so wide is any of the screw-on filters that I have are actually, you actually see them at the very edges. So I put the Tilt Mirage matte box on here because it is wider, and well, the filter itself is larger, so it's not, you're not actually going to see the filter at the edges of the screen. So to sum up, yes, I still think the S1II is the best mirrorless camera for shooting anamorphic, but it's not as good as cinema cameras, for example, like the Pixis, or even like the Cinema Camera 6K, which is cheaper than the S1II, and now has autofocus. I'm actually using autofocus right now. It's not perfect, but it's okay. But right now, without desqueeze going through your external output, that's a big drawback. And if you fix that, Lumix, that's going to make these cameras so much better for shooting anamorphic. If you are interested in the Lumix S1II, I've made a couple other videos about it. Go check those out. Maybe subscribe and do all the other things while you're around, and let me know your thoughts about shooting anamorphic on mirrorless cameras like this. But yeah, that's all for this one. I'll see you next time. Okay, bye.